So today we're going to talk about the metaphysics section. So the question is, what essentially is the nature of persons? That's the question we'll be looking at from different perspectives. As before, we'll begin with looking at the Hindu view, but more than just looking at one Hindu school, we will look at the Advaita Vedanta school today, and then the Nyaya school next week, and then Mimamsa. So for 3 weeks we'll be looking at the Hindu view, then we'll move on to thinking about the Buddhist view, and of course the Charvak. So that's the plan for the next few weeks. Not very exciting, if you like. Just one question is going to be answered, which is, what is the nature of persons according to these philosophers? What do they think that we essentially are? Now let me say something before we begin about this notion of what we essentially are. Does anyone know what essential means? What does it mean to say, when I'm asking the question, what are we essentially? It's a philosophical term of art, if you like, which is thrown around a lot. And the simplest answer, I think, came from Aristotle. He defines the notion of, something is essential, an essential property of a thing, if, without which not. So 3 words, without which not. If it did not have that property, it would stop existing. So that's the claim. So something is essential, without which the thing would stop existing. So wearing a red cardigan is not essential to me. Having black hair is not essential to me. But perhaps being conscious is essential to me, right? If I became a vegetable, because of some accident or something happened, and I became a vegetable and I was no longer conscious, then perhaps it would make sense to say, the body exists, but monomer does not exist anymore, right? So that's the notion of essential property, and that's the question we're really interested in. We are interested in what are we essentially. The kinds of concerns that we will be raising here is the body essential to our existence? Are we only the body, or is there something more? Is consciousness, can it be reduced to the physical stuff? Very much, questions that are alive and well in Western philosophy of mind. What is consciousness? Is consciousness merely a byproduct of the physical stuff, or is it something different, something altogether different? Exactly the same kinds of questions these philosophers were worrying about, quite a long while ago. So get that very clear. When we are talking about what the self is or what the person is, we are interested in what the person essentially is, without which the person would stop existing. That's the idea here. So the school we are talking about is Advaita Vedanta. Advait means dual. So is the negative prefix. So Advait means the monistic or the non-dual school, and Vedanta, remember we talked about the sacred texts of the Hindus called the Vedas. Anta means the last part of the Vedas. So it's a school which finds a monistic philosophy in the last part of the Vedas. Remember, all the Hindu schools believe in the Vedas, and what they say they're doing is trying to interpret the various doctrines found in the Vedas. This particular school thinks that there is a monistic worldview, that there is only one thing that really exists. There is a monistic worldview in the last part of the Vedas, which is also called the Upanishads. That's what the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual, Vedantins, if you like, the monists, are focusing on the last section of the Vedas, which are also called the Upanishads. The most important, so the Vedanta Sutras, again, you remember what the sutras were. They were the aphorisms that the Guru spoke. The Vedanta Sutras were, written about, they say, 500 to 200 BC. But the most important thinker in the Vedanta tradition is Shankara. And we are going to look at Shankara's philosophy. He existed about the 1st century AD. very much, in the heyday of Buddhism. Buddhism was well established by this time, and what he's going to argue against is the Buddhist, but he's also going to argue against some of the other Hindus, because the Hindus differ on, which part of the Vedas they concentrate on, and also how they interpret the doctrines in the Vedas. The Hindu schools have differences of opinion. So, for example, the school we look at next week, Nyaya Vaisheshik, they are pluralists in the sense that they think there is not only one thing that is real. There are many different real things. All individual persons are different and real in themselves. So they think, plurality is real. They're not monists in any sense. They're pluralists, if you like, realists and pluralists. Whereas this particular school is, as I said, monist, and it believes in the reality of only one thing. Which thing? The answer to this question, if you like, for Shankar, put very simply, is the only thing that is real is Brahman or the self. Because one of the theses that he finds in the Upanishads or in the Vedas is that the self is identical with Brahman. So the person, remember we talked about this briefly last time, that the later Hindus denied plurality. They said, in essence we are all one. We all partake in this thing called Brahman, which can be thought of as the ultimate reality, whatever that is. And I'll say more about it in a minute. So according to these schools, the only thing that is real is the self. Self with a big S, if you like, is not talking about individual selves, not talking about you and me as distinct self. There is something we all share. There is something we all have, which is the soul or the self, and that thing is identical with the ultimate principle, the ultimate reality in the universe. That thing is the only thing that is ultimately real. When you ask Shankar about what are the characteristics of this thing, what is the self or what is Brahman, his answer is neti, 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 which means not this, not that, not that. Why does he give only a negative description of, the ultimate reality? We're going to talk about the ultimate reality, which is the basis of everything that exists, including us. We are also, insofar as we are real, we are part of Brahman. And then he says, I can give you no description of it. It can only be described as not this, not that, not that. Only a negative description. Why do you think that might be? Why does he give only a negative description of the ultimate reality? Why can't he describe it in positive terms? Why would that be a problem? It is the only thing is real. It is the only thing that is real. And if you gave a positive description of it, so, to be flippant, let me say it is green. Brahman is green. That means all the non-green things would be excluded out of it. If I said Brahman is like a person, then all the non-persons, trees and animals and chairs and tables would be excluded. So when you're trying to give a description of reality, the ultimate principle, in terms of one thing, it better not be described positively, because any positive description that you give will exclude a lot of other things, right? Any positive description that you give, you call it anything you like, call it all-powerful. Well, what about the less powerful things? How can they partake in something that is all-powerful? And this also happens, surprisingly, this is not just true of the Hindu tradition. In the Christian tradition too, there is discussion about, when they talk about God, the Calvinists, for example, when they talk about God as the ultimate reality, as the only thing that is real, they say God can only be described via negativa, only by negative properties. It's not this, it's not that, it's not that, because any time you start saying something positive, you are going to exclude other things. And that's something, that the monists can't afford. If they say there is one basis for everything that is real, there is one reality, then it cannot be described in positive terms. Right? So that's the starting point, that the only description that you get of the self, if you like, or of Brahman, is in terms of a negative description, neti, 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 not this, not this, not that. Let me see if I can find the passage. No, it's not that one. This is on page 172, right-hand side column, just right at the bottom. That self is to be described as no, no. This is from the Upanishads, one of the Upanishads. That self is to be described as no, no. Designates it as the self, and that the self is cannot be denied. The possible objection that there is no reason to maintain that the soul is known only from the Upanishads. He says that the only way of knowing the self is through the Upanishads, through reading the Upanishads. And you might say, why is that the case? Because there is a lot of things we might say that we can know about ourselves, right? The self is also an object of self-consciousness. When we are conscious of ourselves, when we realize I'm in pain, or I'm feeling jealous, or I'm angry, that's knowing oneself, is it? Do you think of that as knowing the self? Why does Shankar say that the self can only be known through the Upanishads? He denies that, this kind of knowledge of the self, where we say, I know myself, I am basically a very kind person, or I am angry, or I am, I might be deluded and think I'm tall. I think, that might be something and I think I know myself. Shankar says, no, that's not the notion we are interested on. We are not interested in knowing the self as an object. The notion of self that is of interest here is the self as the knowing subject, the thing that does the knowing. And hold on to this point, because it will become relevant when we start looking at the arguments. It is when he's interested in knowing about the self, he's interested in the thing that does the knowing, not the states that are known, my pain state, or my state of jealousy, or my state of my body at the moment, or something like that. What he's interested in is getting at the notion, getting at the thing which is doing the knowing. Think about it in your own case. Do we grasp the knower? Do we have a sense of the subject, if you like, that is doing the knowing? Can you think of any description that you might apply to yourself as a knowing subject, the thing that does the knowing, not what it knows even about itself, that it's tall, or it's in pain, or it's jealous, or whatever. The thing that is doing the knowing is very difficult to describe. Just think about it for a minute. Can you say anything about the knower? In each of you is a knower, a thing that knows. But do we have a grasp of that notion of the knowing self, the thing that does the knowing? What is it that knows? What do you think it is that knows, that does the knowing? Any grasp of that notion? That's what we're trying to get at. That's what Shankar is really interested in. Not an easy question to answer. It's not just a trivial question. It's trying to get at what the nature of the knower is. And it's very difficult, and he's very aware of that fact. And that's why he says, for a starter, we must only describe it in negative terms. Let's see if he can say anything more about it. And he'll give you arguments of why it is not the body, or why it is not that, or why it's not this. But now that we might think, if we've only described it in negative terms, how can we even begin to argue about this? If we don't know what this thing is, if we don't know what the self is, the self in the sense of the knowing self, or the Brahman, which is only described in negative terms, if we don't know what that is, how might we even begin arguing? If I tell, if you don't know what the thing is, what can you say about its existence? It's very difficult to argue whether that thing exists or not, because we don't know anything about its nature. You can't sort of worry about nothingness. Does nothingness exist or not? No, we know nothing positive about its nature. Can it be perceived? No. Can it be inferred? No. Anything that you say, he's going to say, no, we can't. But he does say, this is what he says about what the argument is about. So he starts off, this is on page 172 in the right-hand column. In the left-hand column. So after saying that Brahman is the self, and this self of whose existence all are conscious, so we know something like the self exists, but if Brahman is generally known as the self, there is no room for an inquiry into it. If it is the self, why should we inquire into it? Because we don't know any of its properties. Whether it exists or not, we need to have a positive conception before we can start thinking about whether this kind of thing exists or not. And this is what he says. Not so, we reply, for there is a conflict of opinion as to its special nature. There is a lot of conflict about its special nature. And now he'll list the opinions that exist about it. So unlearned people and the Lokaitikas. Unlearned people and the Lokaitikas, this is on page 172, left-hand side column, unlearned people and the Lokaitikas. The Lokaitika is another name for the Charvaks. They're this worldly people. That's what Lokaitika means. So unlearned people and the Lokaitikas are of the opinion that the mere body endowed with the quality of intelligence. So here's one thesis about the self, that the self is just the body with this special attribute of intelligence or knower. Others, that the organs endowed with intelligence are the self. Others maintain that the internal organ, that's the mind, is the self. Others again maintain that the self is a mere momentary idea. He's referring to the Buddhists here. It's just a momentary thing. Others again, that it is a void. There's a school of Buddhism which thinks that the self is nothing. Others again, to precede the opinion of such as acknowledge the authority of the Vedas. So he's talked about the Charvaks and the Buddhists. Now he's going to talk about other Hindu schools. What does he have to say? Maintain that there is a transmigrating being different from the body, and so on, which is the agent and the enjoyer. So some other schools give you positive things about the self. The self is the thing which does the doing. It's the agent, and it enjoys the fruit of the karma, of the fruits of action. Others teach that being is enjoying only, not acting. The thing is the enjoyer, is the if you like, the enjoyer or the sufferer of the karmic residues. Others believe that in addition to the individual souls, there is an all-knowing, all-powerful Lord. So that's the yoga school believes, that there is, some notion of God. And then he tells you the three last opinions. The first is the opinion of the Nyaya, then the Sankhya, and then the Yoga. And the three opinions mentioned first are so he thinks there is reason to have a debate about the existence of the self, even though we know nothing about its properties, because there are these other opinions. He doesn't call them, knowledge. He thinks there are these other opinions floating about the nature of the self, and those opinions need to be put aside. Those opinions need to be put aside. And so what is he going to say about the self? In the Upanishads, you find these four theses that are listed on the handout. The self is eternal. That means it continues to exist. It is something that does not go out of existence. The self is non-material. So it's not a material thing. Consciousness is the essential property of the self. You find all these four theses in the Vedas, and that the self is identical with Brahman. So in a way, Shankar will give himself the job of trying to prove these four theses, that it's not a thing that goes out of existence. I mean, if you like, you can think of all of these in negative terms. The self is something that does not perish. Again, that's what eternality means, something that does not go out of existence. The self is something that is not material. And again, another negative description. The self is essentially consciousness. Consciousness is the essential nature of the self. That's not a negative description of the self. That is the only positive description you find. And, is he going to be able to defend it? We'll see. How can we talk about, everything, the basis of everything? If he's saying that the self, or Brahman in this case, because the self and the Brahman are identical, is basically consciousness, is essentially consciousness. It's not just basically, but essentially consciousness. That's a positive thesis that he's going to have trouble proving. So what we're going to do from now on is look at the arguments for the first three theses. I'm not going to talk about the fourth one, because the fourth one he thinks can only be known by reading the Vedas. It's only a matter of faith. If you believe in the Vedas, you believe that the self is identical with Brahman. No argument can be given for that thesis. So that's not, philosophically interesting. If you like, it's interesting insofar it helps us to understand what he's getting at, but philosophically, we want to look at the arguments, and so what we will be doing from now on is concentrating on the arguments for these three claims. I will first start with the arguments for eternality, which actually depend on the arguments for the existence of the self. So we'll first talk about arguments for the existence of the self, because the arguments for eternality depend on that. Then we'll talk about the second thesis, the argument for why the self is not a material thing. That's a debate to be had with the Charvaks, because the Charvaks, the materialists, think that the self is just a material thing, because material things are the only things that exist. And the third, that consciousness is the only essential property of the self. This self, or this Brahman, is consciousness only, is a debate he has with the Nayayikas, and hopefully we'll get to discuss all of these three. So that's what we're going to do in the rest of the lecture. Any questions at this point? Have I gone too fast? Do people get, this kind of overall background, what we're doing here? Any questions or clarifications? Yeah.
So consciousness is the only essential property. So that's the only positive description of the self.
Yeah.
So the self is eternal and the self is non-material. Those aren't positive descriptions.
They're not positive, because not material is, of course, a negative description. The self is not this kind of thing. And a way of reading the eternal is the saying that the self is not perishable. It is something that does not go out of existence. So that can also be framed in the negative in some sense. But the claim about consciousness is, I think, a positive claim that, he's going to stick his neck out and say something about the nature of self and, by implication, the nature of Brahman. Any other questions before we move on? Interesting subject. Did you get a sense of, what is at issue here? Hold this thought in your mind, knowing the nature of the knower. That is what he's going to say something about. I gave you a couple of minutes to think about this question. I want you to think about it at the break again. What's the nature of the knower? What is the thing that does the knowing? That's what's interesting about philosophy classes. They raise questions that we've never thought about. When I first looked at this question, completely threw me. Something that never came to my mind. What is this thing that is doing the knower? Can we ever know the knower? Because every time you think of knowing the knower, there's another step taken. The knower is gone, because there is something doing the knowing, right? So it's like something you can never catch. No matter how close you get to it, it will get a step further, because you cannot claim to know the knower, because there is a thing that is doing the knowing that needs to be caught. Do you see the regress here? Anything you say about the knower, I know that the knower is, whatever description you want to put in. But, well, I know. It's that thing, it's that I that is doing the knowing we were interested in. We're not interested in properties of the knower. We're interested in this knowing subject. It's a very challenging question, I think, to think about the self as just the knower and try and get clear about it. But let's get down to something more down to earth to begin with. So I said the arguments for the eternality of the self, keep these apart. I'm insisting on 3 different topics today because one of the expository exercise questions is going to ask you about one of these topics, and people often, in response, give the wrong arguments. So we are asking about arguments for a certain thesis that Shankar has, but they think all the arguments of Shankar are relevant. No, I've put them in separate boxes because I think they're separate arguments for separate theses. So first we will look at the argument for the eternality of the self, which depends on the existence of the self. Then we'll look at non-materiality, and then we'll look at the positive thesis, essential consciousness. Okay, the argument for the existence of the self is very interesting. I'll read out a bit and tell me what it reminds you of, if anything. Very simple argument. This is just an argument for the existence of the self. He's going to use this to argue why the self must be an eternal thing. Okay. So, moreover, the existence of Brahman is known on the ground of its being the self of everyone. For everyone is conscious of the existence of his self. Everyone is conscious of the existence of his or herself and never thinks, I am not. If the existence of the self were not known, everyone would think, I am not. So what he's pointing to is that you cannot consciously think this thought, I do not exist. The existence of the self is established merely by the fact that it is not consistent for us even to think the thought that I am not or I do not exist. Can we think this thought consistently? Here's something more that he adds just to this claim. Just because it is the self, it is impossible for us to entertain the idea even of its being capable of refutation. We cannot doubt the existence of the self. We cannot consciously even entertain this idea that I do not exist. What does this remind you of? Simple idea. I think, therefore I am. Descartes. This is Descartes' argument for the existence of the self. This guy is well before Descartes. Descartes was 16th century. This is at least 16 centuries before. Exactly the same argument. We cannot consistently entertain this idea that I do not exist. Therefore, the self must exist. I am not is something you cannot consistently think. Very simple argument, but I think it does some work. So saying it is impossible for us even to entertain the idea of its being capable of refutation. No one can doubt the existence of the self. That's beyond doubt. I mean, Descartes' way of doing it is, the thing that is doing the doubting, that is established. The very fact, even if you doubt, even that's the state. If it's not thinking, but in the state of doubting, can you doubt that you exist? Well, Descartes says you cannot doubt that you exist because the thing that is doing the doubting must exist. So the thinking, he thinks that establishes the existence of a thinking being or a self. So furthermore, Shankar adds, for the knowledge of the self is not in any person's case adventitious, which means it's not something we accidentally know, not established through the so-called means of right knowledge, but it is rather self-established. The claim is self-established because it does not need any other. I'm reading on page 172 under Adhyay 3, Pada 7, the paragraph below this. in the middle you have, just because it is the self, it is impossible for us to entertain the idea even of its being capable of refutation, for the knowledge of the self is not in any person's case adventitious or accidental, not established through other means of right knowledge. So we do not perceive the self, we do not infer the self. It is rather self-established. The self employs other means of right knowledge for the purpose of establishing previously non-established objects of knowledge. For nobody assumes that such things. So the self is the thing that employs other means of knowledge. So the self is the thing that perceives, the self is the thing that infers. But the knowledge of the self itself cannot be sort of found or cannot be derived by any of these means, because it is the thing which is doing. It is the thing which is doing the knowing. It is self-established because it employs other. So, another argument for thinking that the self exists is that each of us, no matter what you know something, right? You know some facts about the world. So maybe we all know. If you're not, we all know it's Tuesday today, right? If that's a fact that we know, there is a thing that is doing the knowing, and Shankar says that thing is self-established. You can't, by reading the calendar, establish the existence of the self. This is something that has to be presupposed before you have knowledge. The knower must be presupposed, before we can even talk about knowing something. It's a presupposition of our knowing anything at all. Knowing that we are at Monash University, knowing that we are human, presupposes that there must be a knower. That's the claim. You don't need, that's, if you like, the second argument, the self is a prerequisite of knowledge of other objects. The fact that we know something about other objects establishes the thing. So if I say I perceive a chair in front of me, the I there is presupposed as doing the knowing, as doing the perceiving. So two arguments. What you get is two arguments for the existence of the self. One is basically the Descartes argument, which says the existence of the knower or the thinker cannot be doubted because you cannot consciously entertain the thought, I am not. Can you in any circumstances, so now let's just pause and think about this argument. Can you in any circumstance maintain this thought, I do not exist? Have you ever had an opportunity to think about this idea, I do not exist? Or any circumstance you can think in which we can consistently say, I do not exist. Dreams, hallucinations. Do you exist in dreams? Does the self exist in dreams? There is something that is dreaming, the knowing, the knower again. The very fact that there is a dream, the very fact that there is a hallucination, there must be something that is doing the hallucinating. Dreams, hallucinations are not the sort. The body might not exist, but that's not Shankar's claim about the self. He's not saying the self is the body, or he's not saying anything about the self. He's just saying it's the knowing thing. Can you think of any circumstance in which one can consciously entertain the idea, I am not, I do not exist? Someone in a coma, can they consciously entertain the idea that they do not exist?
Isn't that the same as surely they'd be dreaming, right?
Well, if they're in coma, I mean, one definition is that you are not conscious, right? So how could you have a conscious thought if you're in a coma, right? If there is some conscious thought going on, even if there's dreams are also conscious. We are conscious of some of our dreams. Dreams are conscious states in some sense. So even if it's you dreaming, then that means there is some consciousness there. Coma, if it is going to be defined as, being fully unconscious, then you can't have a conscious thought, by definition. So that won't work. In a state of coma, you cannot consistently think that you do not exist. Why? Because in a state of coma, you cannot think anything. So coma won't work, yeah? If you think if you think you're dead. Interesting case. Actually, there are people who have psychotic delusions of this sort. There is examples of this, the person thinks that they are dead, or the person thinks their partner is dead. Unfortunately, there are these syndromes where there is, there is that kind of, and they not only believe that they are dead, or they not only believe that their partner is dead, they also believe they have been replaced by an imposter. Unfortunately, I mean, these people suffer so much. Their own partner of many years, someone's wife, famous case in the psychological literature talking about delusions. It's called Cotard's delusion. My wife has been replaced by a monster. By an imposter, and she's out to kill me, or something like that. That's what these people believe. What do we say about cases like that? Very interesting case. Yes, the person is conscious, yet yes, the person is thinking. How can they think that they do not exist? They think they are dead. They believe that they are dead. They no longer exist. They don't have these Hindu beliefs about eternality, as you rightly said. They believe, is that a conscious thought? The way of, convincing these people that they are not dead is to tell them about their delusion. It doesn't work. They have to use other means as well. But one of the ways of treating them is using cognitive behavioral therapy to tell them, along with medication. And so these are, very serious illnesses. It might seem funny when you read about it the first time, but these are very serious illnesses. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, they're all the time reminded of the fact, well, it can't be that you are dead, because you're the one who has the delusion. Who is then deluded? Who is then having this, false belief? I mean, they will say, my belief is true, I'm dead. I no longer exist, or my wife. That's the more common. I think I've read about the I am dead as well, but the more common one is, someone they're really close to has been replaced by an imposter. And then what the psychologist does is try and convince them that that can't really be the case. So you can't be dead. That's one of the, again, I think, think back about the person the thing that is deluded. Let's not even talk about persons, because that's a very loaded term. The thing that is deluded, that's the one we are talking about. The thing that is deluded must be wrongly thinking, I'm not. Cannot believe, I do not exist. Because cannot rightly believe, it's got to be a false belief. That's why we call it a delusion. It's got to be a false belief that I do not exist. That's why Shankar is insisting there cannot be a case in which you can consciously, have this true thought, I do not exist. Because the thinker that has any thoughts, the doubter, the person who's, the thing that is deluded, that thing cannot consistently think, I am not, or I do not exist. Not possible to do that consistently, so that this I do not exist is true. That can't be the case, that I do not exist. While I'm thinking, I cannot say, I'm thinking this thought, and this thought, I do not exist, is true. That can't be true. It's a contradiction to think. And Shankar uses, this very claim, what he calls this the essential irrefutability. The self is something that cannot be refuted. Irrefutable means something that cannot be denied, something that cannot be refuted. He uses this claim about the essential irrefutability of the self. The claim is this, Basically, I put it on your handout, and let's just think about that claim for a minute. The claim about the essential irrefutability amounts to this. This is at the end of the first paragraph under A, arguments for the existence of self. It is necessary that if I think that I exist, then I exist. So while I'm thinking that I exist is always true. When I say it is necessary, that means true at all times. So read the necessary as it is true at all times that if I am thinking at that time that I exist, then I exist. Is that statement true? That's Shankar's claim, basically, the essential irrefutability of the self. It is true at all times that if I think I exist, I must exist, or I exist. People convinced about this, or is there anything worrying about it? This claim must be always true. I think I exist, then I exist. While I'm thinking I exist, I must exist. And, apply it to anyone. Anything that is thinking, at the time that it is doing the thinking, it must exist. That's the only claim. While I'm thinking, I cannot be not existing. That okay with everyone? Nothing fishy here? So, it's a very important claim. He's going to use this claim to prove that the self is eternal. So he tries another argument, and another argument for eternality of the self. And I think it is on page, where is it? 176. Right down at the bottom, in the right-hand side column. So that consciousness is permanent. So this is after he's argued for the claim that consciousness is the nature of the body, but you do get an argument for consciousness is permanent. That means it's eternal. That consciousness is permanent follows from the uniformity of its character, and therefore we may conclude that the conscious self is permanent also, as follows from the fact that the self, although connected with different states, recognizes itself as the conscious agent, a recognition expressed in judgments as I saw this, and from the fact of remembrance. So from the fact of memory, can memory be a good basis for arguing that the self is an eternal thing? So, you remember, some of you were here last week. Most of you, in fact, I think were here last week. You remember being here last week. Does that prove that you must be eternal? You continue. Does memory, the fact that we know we existed in the past, what does memory tell us? Memory tells us that we existed in the past. The fact that we know that we existed in the past, some of you might even remember, say, your 10th birthday, or your 15th birthday, or 18th. Maybe 18th was important. So you remember your 18th birthday. That means you existed in the past, right? Can memory be a good basis for saying that the self, that the thing is eternal? No, why not? Yeah. It can only say, as far back as you can remember. Memory can't prove eternality. Memory will be too poor to prove eternality because, of course, we can't remember previous lives. If these Hindus are right, we do not remember previous lives, so memory cannot prove eternality. Memory is often used as an argument for proving, if you like, the persistence of the self, that the self continues to exist over a period of time. If memory is an important argument against the Buddhist who thinks that the self exists only at a time. There is no previous self. So memory can prove something. Memory can prove that self exists over a period of time. Memory is used even in the Western literature by Locke, by Parfit. Memory is used as as an argument for the persistence of the self. By that I mean that the self continues to exist over a period of time. But memory cannot prove eternality. What we need is something to prove that the self is eternal, exists at all times, not that the self exists over a period of time. So Shankar, I think, this argument won't work. The memory argument won't work to establish eternality because the memory argument is limited. But, he has got another argument which depends on the essential irrefutability of the self, and that's the argument is on the handout, on the first page of your handout, and I want you to look at it. So this is what he says. Let me first read the quote because it tells you about the order of his argument. His argument is difficult to get right, but I think it tells you. So this is on page 173. The first paragraph, which continues on from the left-hand column up the center. So he says, let us further, halfway through the middle, let us further consider the relation expressed in the following clauses. Just think about these clauses. I know at the present moment whatever is present. I knew at former moments the nearer and the remoter past. I shall know in the future the nearer and the remoter future. So we have, some knowledge. So here the object of knowledge changes. So what we know changes. Last time we found out about the Charvaks. Today we find out about what the Advait Vedantins think. The object of knowledge changes, but according as it is something past or something future or something present. But the knowing agent does not change. So he's saying, you are the one who knew last week. You are the one who is knowing, doing the knowing this week. And you are the one who will be knowing in the future. So here the object of knowledge, what you know, might change as it is something past or present or future, but the knowing agent does not change since his nature is eternal presence. So he thinks it's the nature of the self. He's not arguing that the knowing agent does not change because you know different objects. He's in fact saying the knowing subject, remember what is at issue, the nature of the knowing subject. Its very nature is that it does not eternal presence. And as the nature of the self is eternal presence, it cannot undergo destruction even when the body is reduced to ashes. So he thinks it is eternal even when the body is destroyed, and because the Hindus believed in cremation, it's reduced to ashes, the self continues to exist because we cannot ever even conceive that it ever should become different from what it is. It thus follows from the essential irrefutability of its nature that the self is not an effect. What this means is it is not something that is brought into existence. It's not something that has causes in the past. If it's not something that is caused, it is not something that can go out of existence. It is not something that can be destroyed. If something is caused, if you remove the causes, that thing will stop being, right? So if I were to light a fire here by using some wood, the wood and the ignition, whatever, is the cause of the fire. If someone were to take away the ignition that I use, then I wouldn't be able to, the fire would stop. I would not be able to light the fire. So the fact that, it is not the nature of an effect means it's not something that is caused. If something is caused, then it can be destroyed by removing the causes. Whereas the self is not that kind of thing. But all of this rests on the essential irrefutability. And remember, the claim about essential irrefutability is what I put as the first premise in the attempt at reconstruction right down the bottom. It is necessary, and you all agreed this claim is fine. P1 here should be fine. It is necessary that if I think that I exist, so if I have this thought that I exist, then I must exist. All agreed to that? Yeah? Let's try P2. Right now, I think that I exist. Everyone fine with that too? Premise 1 is fine. We all believe while I'm thinking that I exist, I must exist. That's always true. Premise 2 is kind of right now. I think that I exist. Therefore, can I conclude it's necessary that I exist? Shankar's argument is basically this. From the essential irrefutability, from the first claim, it follows that the self is eternal, that the self must exist at all times. So does the conclusion follow from the premises is my question to you. Look at the handout, look at the bottom of the first page and ask yourself this question. Premise 1, you all agreed with me, is fine. Premise 2, we're talking about a time right now. I think that I exist. Does it follow that I must exist at all times? Does it follow? Or is there something gone wrong? Doesn't follow? Why not?
It only proves that you exist now. It doesn't prove that you always have and always will exist.
Yeah.
Talking about the present.
Good. So the trouble is with premise 2, it's only saying, I think I exist. I think that I exist. But it's only, it's sort of at the time that someone is doing the thinking. I was saying it's in the present. That is not a necessary claim. It's not necessary that I think that I exist. When I'm sleeping, I don't think that I exist. When I'm in coma, I don't think that I exist. When I'm dreaming, I might not be thinking that I exist. There can be lots of times where I'm not thinking the thought. I think that I exist. For this argument to go through, you need P2 to be, it's necessary that I think that I exist. Only then the argument can be used to draw the conclusion that it is necessary that I exist. I'll give you another example just to make the point, to see that this is a bad structure. For an argument, this is a very bad structure. So think about replacing, if I think that I exist, then I exist like, it is necessary that if I shave my beard, then I must have a beard. Agreed? Everyone agreed? Is this a necessary claim? If I shave my beard, at the time that I'm shaving my beard, I must have a beard. Right? So it's necessary that if I shave my beard, then I must have a beard. P2, I shave my beard. Conclusion, it is necessary that I have a beard. No, it's not. Because P2 is indexed to a certain time. For you to get the conclusion that Shankar really wants, the claim about eternality, we need that I think that I exist all the time. And there are lots of times where I think that I exist is not true because I'm not thinking it. I'm not thinking about my existence right now. For example, I'm thinking about Shankar. I'm not thinking about my existence when I'm sleeping, when I'm in deep sleep. I'm not thinking about my existence when I'm trying to write a paper or, have lunch. I'm enjoying the food, not thinking about my existence. So the conclusion doesn't follow because it's indexed to a certain time. It's a very, I think, interesting attempt because he does have the essential irrefutability, but it does not go through, does not work.